Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Here is again Norbert Alzenberg from Kleve for the study program International Taxation and Law. And this semester I owe you a lecture on international tax planning. Now, this is a relatively complicated field for talking about that. So, this is something for people who already have developed a better and deeper understanding of tax rules. So, if you just begin to deal with taxation, just put that lecture here aside and come back to it later when you have a far better understanding of what it's all about. Well, what it's all about, ladies and gentlemen, that is naturally an interesting thing when it comes to international tax planning. Everybody talks about that. Everybody is enraged about that, and now, surprise, nearly nobody deeply knows about that. I also do not claim to know deeply what international tax planning is about, but at least I made some initial beginner's thoughts on that. So you will very often see that people talk about international tax planning issues and didn't analyze the matter properly. So it might be that even if after these small remarks at the end of half a year or so, it might be that then you don't know much about the topic. Probably your knowledge is not good, but it might already begin to, yeah, to qualify among the best knowledge which is available. At least I hope so. Now, um, if we start to talk about international taxation and international tax planning in the frame or within a lecture, then the first aim, or no, the first question should probably be, what is a realistic and reasonable aim for a lecture on international tax planning? And the first thing is, when you look to books about international tax planning, then you see that German books on international tax planning, I'm from Germany, so German books is always my first thing where I look to, that they deal with international arrangements, constructions where you can save taxes, but purely in front of the background of the German legal framework. Now, when you try to escape that narrow angle, narrow perspective, and order an American or an English book, then you find out, okay, they discuss the loopholes of their tax system, um, which they can exploit by international construction. So they also have a purely national perspective. So what they can do as tax saving models from the background of their national tax system. That is not really satisfactory if an audience like our audience is made up by students from many, many different countries, because learning about the loopholes in German tax system or in the English or American tax system, that is really no help. So we would need something like a general approach. Something else can also be seen. The ones who are more familiar with the topic sometimes have heard of very famous, attractive, um, really bombastic tax saving models. And so they want to get informed how these tax saving models work. Um, it's nearly impossible to to start a conversation with somebody who is familiar with tax planning and then to survive 2 minutes before the keyword comes up, the double Irish Dutch sandwich model. Now, again, this is a very special tax saving model. It's highly difficult, highly attractive, okay, I know. So naturally, people are keen on getting that explained, how it works. But surprise, um, the first thing is it does not work any longer. It does only work for the companies who have begun to exploit it or use it before 10 years ago or so. They can still profit from it. Newcomers can't. So that's historical knowledge, nothing else. And if you just sit down and ask others to explain them, their famous ideas might be interesting, but that doesn't teach you how it is done. So realistic aims for a lecture on tax planning should be, in my opinion, that you learn to think about how a tax saving model might be developed, on which things you must have an eye. So, what you have to do in order to generate own ideas, to check them if they might work. And so, that is something which is, in my opinion, probably the only thing which might be of general interest. So, not only for the German or English student, but from students from everywhere. So, the important thing should be have an eye on how could it be done? How can I get ideas? How do the ideas of others work? How were they found? How can one check if an idea could work or so? And the other thing might also then be how can I learn to find out on myself how a tax saving construction of somebody else works and where the dangers are. So that is where you can profit from. Just getting confronted with famous tax-saving construction of others. Well, nobody will ever pay you for being able to reproduce merely the ideas of others, probably without deeply understanding them and so applying them to situations where they don't function. So let's agree on our aim is to develop some simple, perhaps naive rules or approaches how tax planning can be tried and how perhaps tax saving constructions can be understood. So the focus should be on how can we learn to think about taxation, not how to understand the thoughts of others. Hmm? So that brings us for that lecture to a program which usually, or as usual, begins simply by defining what we are going to do. You probably have already heard in other lectures or in other remarks by me that the first thing when you deal with a topic is usually that you try to define the technical terms so that you have an idea or clearly have in mind on what you're talking and what you're going to leave out. So the first thing which we will have to do in a tax planning lecture is to think about what is tax planning for us. And we will have to ask questions combined with that. For example, what's the difference between the usual tax planning and the international tax planning? Why do we directly talk about international tax planning? Um, what is perhaps the line between what is regarded as a legitimate tax planning and so-called aggressive tax planning? In the moment, for example, the press and the politicians always yeah, are highly busy with complaining about aggressive tax planning, the one which they don't want. So it might be interesting when nowadays the general idea seems to be legitimate tax planning is okay, aggressive tax planning is not. Where does the line go? So what's the difference between the two forms of tax planning? So what is morally okay and what is not? Then the aim of our lecture, I already told you something about that. That is something which we might clarify a bit then, and then it should come to the details. So one important thing is naturally we should restrict ourselves to legal tax planning. So you must be familiar again with the red lines between tax planning, tax abuse, tax avoidance, tax evasion, or tax fraud. So what's illegal and what is legal? And then naturally, the very inconvenient things happen to begin because the basics for tax planning are naturally the basic knowledge on taxation and its application. So you will have to possess a perfect knowledge about the unlimited and limited tax liability rules in your country and in the countries involved in your tax planning construction. You will have to learn about or to repeat again the contents of a double taxation treaty and how its rules are applied. So you must be able to form an opinion on, and a correct opinion on, what a double taxation treaty between two states says and how that influences the treatment of your specific case. And last but not least, you know that every time when you do something which the fiscal administration does not really like, they try to ignore your real behavior and say that was not the real thing, it was an abusive behavior. You abuse the possibilities of legal options, and in reality what you did was something completely different economically, and we are not going to tax you on what you did but what we think it means economically. So you will have to think about the term of tax abuse again, and you will also be familiar with all these specific anti-abuse legislations where the tax legislator thought, well, with that abuse construction, probably I will not succeed. I make some specific anti-abuse legislation for people exploiting a certain tax saving chance. And the usual approach there is usually that the tax saving which you can obtain by using a certain construction is equalized by an additional higher tax burden for especially the people using that construction within your domestic law. For example, there is controlled foreign companies taxation, which ends up in the idea, or is based, or leads to the outcome that if you invest money in a company in a tax haven and there you pay only 1% corporation tax, that then the shareholder at home gets an additional tax of, let's say, 24%, which is exactly equalizes the tax saving effect, so that in the end nothing is gain. There is no gain from the construction, because if your average or usual tax burden is 25%, everything you save by paying only 1% abroad is equalized by the additional tax of 24% on you in your home state. So that's usually the principle of anti-abuse legislations. If they identify things where you legally save taxes abroad and they don't think it's okay, you invent specific additional tax burdens to compensate that. By the way, that is an important difference between the legal and the illegal tax saving models. The illegal ones rely on hiding facts. So introducing additional taxes on top makes no sense if the people already have taken refuge to lying. So if there is an illegal tax saving maneuver going on, the only thing you can counterattack it is by improving the situation on information. So there, the countermeasure of the states is usually improving their opportunities to obtain the hidden information. Whereas when you have a legal tax planning construction, under the normal legal rules, you end up with a very small tax, and that is then counterattacked just by introducing an additional tax, which equalizes in most cases then your tax saving effect. Good. Let's come back to point 4 on the list here. So whenever you want to deal with tax planning, you need to know all the basics perfectly, because you must form an opinion what will be the outcome of your case after you took your measures. And for this, you have to know all the rules. And if you overlook one, that's going to end up badly. So we will have to repeat a mass of stuff from the beginnings and from the middle of your study programs, naturally. Interesting will also be the current fight of many states against international tax planning, what they regard as aggressive and illegitimate and immoral. So we will have to keep in mind always what new countermeasures the states have introduced. There is a mass of things, thanks to the heroic tax saving attempts or achievements of Google, Apple, and others. We have a strong, very comprehensive, very big list of countermeasures taken by states together on an international level. The so-called BEPS project of the OECD can be named here, where they said we must do something against tax saving on the international scale by multinational enterprises, where they introduced many, many measures which did not exist in former times. And so we have to make ourselves familiar with all that stuff. So additional duties to supply information on cross-border investments, so that the things which you do abroad will not get overlooked. That treaties with other states are improved or amended by adding mechanisms for automatic exchange of information between the fiscal authorities concerned. There is something like the American FATCA system, so where all private bank accounts all over the world of an American citizen have to be reported to the American fiscal institutions. If not, the bank is cut off from the international financial system completely. And that is something which other countries also want to profit from, and more they do. Furthermore, you have EU activities in the field. Well, so many rules on international tax planning opportunities in the last time. There is even now something which in former time people would never have thought to be possible. There is a multilateral agreement on certain clauses for international taxation, the multilateral instrument of the OECD, which overrides nearly 3,000 double taxation treaties by not a perfectly uniform text, but by a uniform set of clauses from which all the member states of that agreement have to select. So there is an important harmonization on the international level. There is even, that can be seen by that multilateral instrument, there is even a tendency to creating uniform legislation on an international scale for taxation, something which would have been regarded as directly an import from hell some 30 or 50 years ago, because there they always said, in taxation affairs, every state is sovereign, and naturally there can never be something like a compelling international custom on how tax rights should be distributed among the countries involved. There, everybody can freely agree. Now that that rule begins to fall down naturally, or to erode slowly at least. Um, so more and more things are invented there, and we will have to know them, think about them, how they can impact the practicability of our tax saving ideas. The last thing which was brought forward, for example, was an obligation, at least between all the EU member states, that the members of tax advising firms or other people who design a tax saving model for others have to inform the fiscal authorities about the tax saving construction and its details. So that brings forward enormous consequences, because if you take part in the preparation of something which might be qualified as a tax saving construction and fulfills one or several of the tests in the law, and you don't signalize that to the fiscal authorities, you violate fiscal rules. It might be possible that by your negligence, by your not communication the information somebody might obtain a fiscal advantage which otherwise would not have been granted. So it might be that a tax advisor can be involved or can be accused of a tax fraudulent behavior by others. So tax planning becomes more and more dangerous too. Now you see from when you see that program that we have indeed, at least for the basics already, a very, very huge list of things where we have to talk about. So international tax planning will not be easy. The first thing we will have to focus on is naturally repetition of all the details. Now, where are they? Here. Huh? All the necessary basic knowledge will have to repeat it, and we will have to talk about that in more detail. You will have to be familiar with that completely again, and that is what we will have to do in the next small remarks, which I'm going to give to you in the next videos. So let us quickly sum up again. Here you see a short summary of what we talked about just now in form of some few slides, and we are going to talk about these entries during the next weeks probably. Goodbye till next time.